All right. So Jacob, what all are we covering today?
Well, the first thing we're going to do here, Chad, especially for the people that are first timers, welcome everyone. Very excited to have you here. We're going to do a quick recap of all the things we covered in the past episodes of building blocks. After that, what we want to actually talk you through is planning for asset updates. We try and ship a bunch of new features fairly often for design systems here. And when we actually ship those features, you as design system managers that are out there have to take it upon yourself to update your libraries and kind of ship those out to your users. That doesn't always go smoothly because there are situations where it does require an actual strong refactor in order to do that. And so you should prepare ahead of time and test these things before you push them out. So we're going to do a deep dive into that. And really what we're going to do is we're going to show you not only some best practices, but we're going to do some live demos as well. And then we're going to polish this up with an AMA at the end. And for the AMA, please use the Q&A, little question and answer section of Zoom to ask those questions. We'll add them into some slides and we'll tackle the ones that we see a lot of communicant response upon at the end of this actual session. Cool. And shall we jump straight in, Chad?
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about building blocks and what we've all built together so far. So in our first episode of building blocks, we really outlined, everything that goes into a design system. Really that your UI kit is not solely your design system. There's so much more to it than that. And what we really wanted to cover in that first episode is, hey, you're ready to start building a design system. There's so much content out there. Where do you really begin? And, we broke down in this one, just how to get started with what you already have. And so we'll walk you through a little of that in the first episode.
Absolutely. And one of the other things we really covered in the second episode was creating that first little sticker sheet of components that you had. And it was for just like the very early entry into creating something that was distributable for your team. So here's some styles, here's some components, and here's a consistency check across everything. That's one of the great things about sticker sheets is it really allows you to visualize that consistency.
All right. So once we then started to create components, we talked about how to apply some polish to them and really publish out your V1 of your asset library. So how to create styles, how to start creating some basic documentation, how to get out some core components and start getting feedback on those from teams who are going to use them.
And one of the next things we covered after that, and Chad really made a mention of this as well, is that documentation is integral to design systems, not only for just consumption and understanding like how to use it, but also around documenting processes for update management, as well as contributions back into that design system. And so we really did a deep dive there of the levels that you can have of design systems, whether it's just documentation inside of your libraries themselves to fully custom sites that are there.
All right. And in our last episode, which was episode 5, we covered a bit on the ABCs, or as we called it, the CBAs of contribution models and what that can look like with your design system. Also that not everything has to be in your design system. Some things may live with product teams, and that's okay. We share some tips and tricks and best practices around thinking through contribution models and how you can solicit contributions for your system. All right. So that brings us to today, which is episode 6. And as Jacob mentioned in the agenda, let's talk a little bit about planning for asset updates. So thinking about everything that we've covered so far, you've got to a point that you're publishing out assets, teams are starting to use those, design files are being created, and Figma comes along and releases some new features. And, as Jacob mentioned, you want to build those into your assets in your libraries. So one of the first things we think about with planning is, how can we minimize the chaos? The last thing we want to do as design system maintainers is to completely break everything for everyone who's using the assets. And I can't stress this enough. A little upfront planning before you just start diving into making the updates, as tempting as it is, the planning really goes a long way. Now, a few things to think of when it comes to planning to minimize that chaos. I like to always recommend 3 things at a minimum. Think about what is going to be updated, where you're going to make those changes, and then when you're planning to roll that out and how you'll communicate that. A good thing to think of as well is, what if something breaks along the way? What is my plan going to be for reverting this, or not necessarily revert? What do I need to potentially plan to roll forward? And probably the most important piece of advice when we think about planning is to acknowledge that, things will happen. They may be minor, they may be major, but things don't always go according to plan. Be flexible and, allow your plans to be updated. So let's break that down a little bit on what to update. Now, we covered this a little bit in a previous session as well, around polishing your components. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail in this episode, but in general, what we found from talking to the community as well as from our own practices, making updates to the most used variation of a component is going to be the way to go for minimal impact to teams, for also having the adoption of that new feature. And Jacob will show a little of this here in a little bit when it comes to actually making updates to the components. Ways that you can discover which components are the most used. If you're on an organization or enterprise plan, you can use design system analytics within Figma to dive into very specifically which variants are the most commonly used within your component sets. You can also look through files. That's one of the great things in Figma on any plan is that you have that visibility to go into any open teams. You can view those files and really get an idea for what components are being used the most. Additionally, you can also have conversations with the consumers of the system. I also would add, have conversations with your development team as well. They may have analytics already in code on which components are being the most used from the library, and that may help give you insights as well on what the adoption is for specific components across the system. And then a big piece to keep in mind, as you're starting to think through what you're updating, a major breaking change, it is possible. So you might come across this and say, I'm going to completely refactor a component, and this is going to be a major breaking change. You may want to just create an entirely new component at that point and start to plan out what that migration plan looks like. Are you going to deprecate the old component in, say, 60 days? You'll put a deprecation notice on it, communicate that out to teams, give another 30 to 60 days to migrate to the new component. Things to think about as you're working through those updates. Now, the second point I called out is where to make the changes. Are you going to update a component directly in your library? Are you going to use a branch for it? We talked a little bit about this in the last session on the ABCs of contributions. It also applies to you as a maintainer making updates to your components. You can update them right in the main file. It has the pros that it's right there. You can see it, publish it, you're done. There's also the advantage of using a branch for it, so folks don't come into the file and grab the in-progress work. One thing, if you are working in the library, that I always like to recommend to folks is if you are going to make an update, let's say I'm going to just update these buttons directly, I may want to put an emoji before it, like a red dot, or I might want to just put some text before it, do not use, work in progress. Doing that without actually publishing it, so you don't publish that out to everyone, but it can be an indicator for folks who come into the library and know, okay, this is being worked on. I shouldn't use this right now. And of course, if you're doing a new component you're adding, you don't even have to do it in the library. You can build that anywhere. You could build that in your drafts. You could build it in a private file and just bring it into the library when you're ready to publish it. And that last point, plan for the unexpected. I don't know how many times, if you look at my keyboard shortcuts and the history there, I probably use Command Z a lot. Undo is your friend. Sometimes you'll drag things into an auto layout container and it didn't flow correctly. You changed your settings. Sometimes you don't know, undo that. Also, don't be afraid to use version history. Of course, Figma autosaves your work as you're going, so you can always bring up your version history and restore to an earlier point as you've been working. I mentioned the thinking about when you might want to revert as well. To go deeper on that, I'd say think about what level of oops would warrant reverting all of that work. Now, if it's something that's minor where, okay, everyone's layout's shifted by like 2 pixels, that may not be a big enough oops to revert everything. You might just want to publish a new update and move forward. But if it's something where you've somehow completely broken everyone's everything everywhere and your Slack or Teams notifications start popping up, then you might want to restore the previous version, publish, and readdress it. But the last point I will leave on this is that, admittedly, it's not realistic or possible to plan for every possible outcome. And that's where adapting and being flexible and doing it live is really the way to go. The biggest piece is make sure you communicate with the rest of your team as you're going. Hey, plans have changed, or, we've started to work on this update and realized we can actually refactor this to make it a bigger impact. Do we do that now? Do we do that later? Have those conversations with your team as you're going. All right, so I talked a little bit about the planning side. Now, let's actually update and talk about how we test those components.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to do a little demo here, and I'm going to show you what I tend to do whenever I'm updating some of these design system components. So let's jump straight into it. So I've got my little UI library here, and this is the previous one that we worked through and some of the other kind of building blocks that were present. And I want to update some of these components to not only have some of the new features that we have, but I also want to re-architect some of them as well. Before I do that, though, I want to do one main thing first. And Chad, what's the number one thing we should always do before we start making drastic changes to our library?
Well, I think either working in a branch here or put a big message that it's a work in progress and to not use that currently.
You nailed it. And I actually even queued up an article from someone over here about branching in particular in Figma, which will answer any questions that you have about it. I'm going to post it in chat as well if you want to look at that another time. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and create a branch of this. I'm going to call this props v2 updates because I want to update it to the latest features of component props that we just shipped. So once we've gone and created this branch, before I even start making some changes to some of the components that are here, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create some clones of these components themselves. And just having these instances be present next to the ones that I'm working on, along with some overrides as well, will let me see if I've actually broken anything as I'm updating the master components that are present. So I'm going to just change these to whatever. Wow, I'm a card. Neat. And I'll change this one down here too. And it doesn't really even have to be anything sensible. The only thing that we really want to see there is that these values are preserved as we update these components. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to update these cards here with some of the new features that we've launched with props v2. But before I do that, I have to opt into these features. We're launching props v2 features as a beta. And so we do want you to be aware that it is still in beta, but you can test these features now by opting into it. How I'll do that is I'll select a component. I'm going to go over to the component description over here, and we'll have this little flag over here that says try new authoring features for component properties beta. I'm just going to toggle this on. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into 2 of the features of the 3 that we've shipped with this. The first thing that I want to highlight is preferred values. So notice the icons that are over here for these cards in the top right. Each of these are really a subset of a selection of 3 icons that I have present over here. And normally before, when I created an instance swap of these actual instances inside of these cards, it would select from a wider library of all the different components that I had there. Now, by actually using component props v2 and using preferred values, what I can do here is I can select this little icon over here, and I'm going to go ahead and create an instance swap property on this. And we'll just name this icon. And now notice that we have this section down here, which is for preferred values. And I'm going to go ahead and add in all of the other icons that I have over here. Now, when I create this property for these preferred values that are over here, and I select my instance, and notice I'm double checking to see if this has changed or not, and it hasn't. But I now have this little icon prop over here. And right now it's set to work icon, but I now have those preferred values that I can easily swap between. One of the other things that we've shipped with this as well is simplified instances. Notice this large card that we have over here. There's a lot of things inside of it that we don't want users to change, whether it's the learn more link at the bottom, the fact this is a tip at the top, or even things like these little background objects and decorations that are there. There's a lot of layers inside of these little cards that are there. And especially when I'm handing it off, not only for designers to use, but also especially when I'm handing these things off to developers to implement, I really want a simplified architecture for this component that only shows the layers that have specific overrides that are on top of them. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select this component here. I'm going to go into the component options and the configuration, and I'm going to select simplify all instances. And now when I select this and I show the actual instance of it over here, notice we see a collapsed version of this. So what we see is this little subtext right here, this title text that's over here, and everything else is hidden. The reason for that is it's because I only have props assigned to the title and subtitle of this card over here. But remember before how I added in a little instance swap property for this up here? If I do the same for this card as well and add in a quick little icon instance swap, then what we can see is this icon also appears in the layer list over here. So we really try and surface only the things that people are going to use and they're supposed to use when configuring some of these components. So those are some of the cool features in Props v2, which is preferred values and simplified instances. I'm going to jump into another one. Before, we had these checkboxes that we built out. And we built these out in a specific way where we had all of the combination options of the label and the actual checkbox elements itself, all in one giant variant set. But notice some issues with this approach that's here. See, we have these danger versions down here where we have like, there's an error going on or something like that. Notice that this error checkbox doesn't actually have all of the states inside of this list of variants. So for example, there's no indeterminate state that also has an error label on it. Likewise, there's no selected state where we have that error label, or there's no selected but also disabled. There's a bunch of things that we haven't captured in this large list of variants that are here. And one of the reasons for that is if we were to separate these things out and consume some of these in a way where we were using a nested instance inside of this, it's very hard to actually change these. So here, what I can do is I can switch this from being unchecked to being a checked state. But if I take one of these where I'm using a nested instance for the actual checkbox element itself, notice that I can't really change the state from up here. I can change things like, this is a warning or this is a default. But in order to actually change that checkbox itself, I have to select the inner layer for that checkbox and then change the actual interaction or the value of this to checked and unchecked. This is often really confusing for designers because they're not sure what they need to do to get it into the configuration state they need it to be in. The other thing is that when you're handing it off to developers, it can be often hard to tell which things they need to transfer for these overrides. So what we've done is we built out something known as expose nested instances. Before I do that though, I'm going to go ahead and create some clones of these just so we have instances for demos and comparison, just like before. That way, what I can do is make sure that we're not breaking anything along the way. And so I'm just going to change these to, this will be a warning maybe, and I'll change this one to be something else. And the only thing I'm really doing here is just adding some overrides onto this so that we can see that those overrides transfer as we're making these changes. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, instead of doing this long list of variants, I'm going to expose these properties of this checkbox inside of this larger checkbox with label. And the way that I do that is through this properties panel over here. So I'm going to select this one, and then I'm going to go to this properties panel. And now we have this new feature over here, which is expose properties from nested instances. So I'm going to click on this, and the only thing that's inside of it is checkbox, so it's pretty easy to find that here. So I'm going to say I'm going to expose from this checkbox itself. And now one of the really cool things that we have is if I look inside of this instance that's here, I now not only have the state of this top level item, but I also have all the actual values for this checkbox itself. So I can easily switch between things like selected, checked, unchecked, indeterminate, and I can capture all of the states and allow for that configuration at the top level. So that's something we're super excited about for Component Props v2. We really feel that it's going to help a lot in a lot of situations that are out there. It's also going to help, especially in situations where you have things like base component architectures. While we don't recommend that you approach things with a base component architecture, if you're doing a refresh of your library or if you're building it from scratch, there are situations where it's hard to migrate off of those. So this will help in those situations as well. But I do want to address one other thing that's here as well. And that is we created an entirely separate set of components here when we updated it to have this separate model where we had the instance inside of the actual checkbox with label. And the issue with this is if we publish this now out, this checkbox with label won't actually update any of the instances that have this old checkbox with label. So I need to go and modify this large list of variants rather than creating a new one so that the update flow actually makes sense. And so I'm going to do a few things here that really help me whenever I'm doing this. And I'm going to go a step further with the instance that we had over here in order to try and detect any issues that come up as I'm changing this. So I'm going to add in a few other little things over here as overrides. And I'm going to create a few of these just to represent a few of the different states that we have. So this one has an error, something like that. And we'll just go with these two. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a visual diff trick that we showed in the previous building blocks. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this layer, and I'm going to paste it again directly on top of it. So we can see there's two of these things that are overlaying each other. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to detach the top level component that's on top of it. So now what we have is we have this instance that's detached on top of an actual instance that's there. And you'll see why here in a second. But the first thing I'm going to do before I go and do that is I'm going to switch the layer blend mode of both of these two things to difference. And what this is going to do is this is going to show me the difference between the top element and the bottom element. And the cool thing about this is because we detach the top element that's there, it shouldn't change no matter what we change in our system. Whereas that bottom element will inherit the changes from anything we make to this checkbox label that's over here. So I'm going to do the same thing again here real quick. So I'm going to copy this, paste it, detach the top one, and then switch this to a difference mode. And I highly recommend doing this and creating a visual litmus test for all of your components, which really help to see if you've broken any changes that are present. And so now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select some of these, and all of these have auto layout associated with them. I'm just going to go and change some slight little variations of this auto layout, and we'll see what happens over here as we make those changes. Notice immediately as I kind of make those changes there, we get some visual errors in this. It's a really easy way to clearly see the issues that you're having in your components as you're making these updates. And so what I need to do here is I need to go through and remove a few of the variants that I have so that I really only have these three combinations over here. And then what I need to do is I need to go through and add instances of this checkbox to each of those three options that I have over here. So I'm going to select all the ones that I don't need, which is this one, this one, this one. I'm going to get rid of them real quick. And then I'm also going to get rid of this one, and this one. So now I have just these three over here. And then I'm going to take an instance of one of these. I'm going to paste it into here. I'm going to delete this item. So we have that. And likewise, update all of these other ones. So as we've gone through and done this, notice in our visual litmus test, we did see some errors over here. And because we had this litmus test, it was very easy to catch those as we were updating this. So that little error at the outline of that checkbox didn't transfer over here, which means that as people are updating, they're going to need to be aware that that actual error happened. And so I can do a few things here in order to actually update this. Either I can work with re-architecturing this so that that actually transfers in the correct way, or what I can do is publish this as a new actual version of this library. Both are options that we can address and we can think about, but it is really up to you and the actual situation that you're going through at that time. We've done a few little comments on this before, so be sure to watch the other building blocks where we talk more about this kind of update practice that's there. But yeah, those are some of the new Props v2 updates features that we have. So I'm going to hand it back to Chad now, and we're going to talk about some wrap up, and then we're going to jump into the Q&A. Oh, and I think you're muted, Chad.
Of course.
Classic.
So one other thing that is helpful there too, as you know, as Jacob was working in the branch here, you know, I just wanted to show, if we take a look here in the checkbox, this is the main library. We can see that I'm not seeing any of those changes. So this goes back to that planning on where you're going to make your updates, because if I come into the library here, I'm in a sense blissfully unaware there's changes happening because I've just seen exactly what I need. But also with the visual diff for the testing, which is a brilliant idea. You also get the other piece here. So, you know, let's say we're all set now and we are ready to merge this in. We're now going to get into our planning for how do we communicate these changes out. We're on that second last piece right before we publish. So one thing we can do if we come up to our branch to review and merge the changes, it's going to now bring up and show me everything that's been changed right within our file here. So no conflicts from what's in main. And we can see here we have our checkbox, you know, the new pieces we've added. We can see we've edited the checkbox with label. So I'm going to go into just this one here, where, as Jacob demonstrated, we've removed some of those different variants we no longer needed in order to have the props on the latest. And just like that visual diff on the canvas there, you also get that in the overlay here. So I can also scrub back and forth and start to see what those changes are right here in the file. So another way that we can also verify our changes right before we merge it in to main. So I'm just going to merge that so we are ready to go. And we're now going to get ready to publish this library out with all of the changes. But how do we communicate those? So again, as I said before, communication is key with all updates. And when we go to publish, you know, make sure that you're using that component description in the publishing window to talk about what has been updated. Now, if the updates are impacting the actual core usage intent for the component, and it's going to require code changes as well, you should definitely update your documentation to reflect these changes. Now, if it's just a change in this case where we're implementing a new feature to make lives of consumers easier, that may not be in our core component documentation, but it is still key to let folks know about those changes. So one place to do that is, of course, again, in the publishing window, because when folks get the notification that there are component updates available, they're going to see this description to know what has changed with those. It's always good to set folks at ease because you've tested things and you've shown that things aren't going to break in your tests, to provide that reassurance in here that, you know, it's not a breaking change. It's not going to hopefully break anything else. So that way folks can just click accept update and they're good to go. Now, if it's a workflow change in like this, where it's exposing the nested instances, it's going to make it easier for folks to use the component. A couple things that can be really, really helpful that I've found, and I've seen some great examples from the community doing this as well. Create little how-to videos and tips to share out with your teams using the library assets, and give a little walkthrough, do a little demo of how this works now. It can really be helpful for folks who are visual and want to also follow along. They can replicate exactly what you are showing. And it really helps with educating folks on how you're intending for those components to be used. And the other piece here is to not just rely on within Figma, right? Like share and promote your updates outside. Or up8s, little typo there. Be sure to share those outside as well. So if you have a design system notification channel in, you know, Slack, in Teams, in Zoom chat, be sure to blast that out there and let folks know, hey, the library's been updated. Here's what the changes were, and promote that outside. Also, if you have recurring office hours for your design system team where folks can come in and ask questions, highly, highly recommend that. If you're not doing that, having an hour or two a week where teams can come and ask the design system team questions, hugely, hugely beneficial. All right. So with that, we're going to switch over to our Q&A portion. So behind the scenes, Vanessa, our unsung hero who we love so much, has been gathering all of your questions and getting those brought over into our slides. So we're going to jump over to those questions here. And we're going to do our presentation just right on the canvas here.
Woo. All right. One of the first questions that we have from Flip is, if I turn on the beta component features, i.e. preferred instances, are they visible to everyone on my team if they don't also have the beta features enabled? This is a great question, and I apologize for not covering it there in the actual demo. If you enable these features, it exposes the authoring features to just you. However, everyone has the consumption features on by default. So if you simplify an instance, no matter who it is in your company or a consumer of that, will see that as a simplified instance. But they will not be able to create their own simplified instances without opting into the beta. So authoring is what's behind the beta flag. All the consumption is available for everyone. So any changes that you make to these components will be seen by everyone.
Awesome. And another question from Lapierre: how do you like to build components that can contain any variety of content? A modal, for example, can contain anything from images to tables to buttons. You can't possibly build a variant for each use case, but a simple modal has to be detached to toss elements into. This is a great question. And a way that I like to approach this is thinking through kind of the slot method approach, which is actually even easier now with having preferred values. this is something that I know Jacob created a cool example of as well. But you can put in component instances that are a placeholder within this component, and then you could specify preferred values for, a header component instance, for an image container, for a text block, for an action bar. You can have all of these different building blocks for the modal specified as components that can be switched in. So that way your modal container itself, it's just a container. And, it kind of borrows from the concept on the code side as well, where you would place other components within that container. There is a couple of videos out there for it. If you search for slots in Figma, even our designer advocate, Louis, old Disco Lou, created a guide on a thought approach to doing slots within Figma.
Absolutely. And I'll touch upon a few other things here as well. Chad really covered it. Using instances and swapping things out is the best approach right now. That said, we are aware that people want to have freeform content inside of instances, and a really proper kind of slot feature in the future is definitely something that we are considering. I'd also highly recommend, as a shout out here, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but we do have Schema coming up soon. And there is a really great talk from Nathan Curtis on this that he's going to be talking through, which is architecting subcomponents, which will really tie into this. All right. Is there a way to replace an existing component with another one over many different files? We have some duplicates that I would love to get rid of. A great question. You can do this on a per file basis, but you can't do this across your entire company and say, hey, replace everything with this. This is something that was very deliberate on our part. We want really a lot of those design files to really require action inside of them in order to update them. And that just is so that we can preserve some of the history of those files. We're really making sure that we're not making huge breaking changes across the entire company that's there. It's just a really risky and highly dangerous thing. We do understand that there are situations where you would really want that, but it does come with a lot of danger as well. So currently no way to do that.
Yeah. And the other piece on the per file there as well is if you are doing an entirely new library, sometimes we'll see teams do that where they're going into an entirely new library to get rid of some of the different duplicates. You can use swap library for that. At the same time, instance swapping is always going to give you a lot more granular control over specifically what things are changed. So I'd say this really ties back into planning as well, and how you're going to communicate those changes out. All right, we currently have a library.
I'll
go ahead, Jacob.
Here. Yeah, so this is from Henrik. He's asking, we currently have a library with our primary design system components, and we also have a rethemed version of this library of these same components, but with different colors for different specific product teams. And really the question is there a better way to kind of manage this in the current situation? Henrik, it's definitely an area that we are aware of, and it is a trouble and pain point issue today, especially for really large organizations that have a lot of different kind of product teams that are out there. Mm-hmm. We are working on an actual design tokens feature right now, which is the answer to this, and it will help with those kind of rethemes that are out there. So it allows for things like light mode and dark mode, and also for these different kind of product-based themes as well. Unfortunately, for the time being, it is just going to be something that is going to be hard to manage. But hopefully, once we kind of launch this feature, it will be something that will actually help with this quite a bit. Chad, do you have any recommendations in the current stage of things of how to manage some of this?
Yeah, we see a lot of this from teams. I always like to default to the community here because what works for one approach doesn't necessarily work for another. So this is where I always like to recommend, some of the YouTube videos. There's some great Medium articles out there. There's some great threads on Twitter. Some great terms to get you started is approaching multi-brand design systems in Figma, multi-theming in Figma. I know whenever I'm looking at, hey, what's the community talking about on this? Those are a couple of my go-to search terms. And there's a lot out there and a lot of great considerations. In general, what I've found at my previous company, I had this as well, where we had multiple brands. And currently the way, Henrik, you're doing this, it is one of the best approaches for it currently. As Jacob mentioned, in the future with token support, this will be much, much easier. But for today, it is the best approach to have those separate libraries per brand. All right, we're going to jump right back over here. Can you share tips about how to communicate with product teams when we work in a large organization?
Chad, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways this could go. I think so. If this is just communicating from a design system team, talking out to multiple different product teams, Bruno, one thing I would say here is, don't rely on just written communication. Things get lost. That's where sometimes creating a Loom video and posting it out there, posting the link to the video in a public channel in your company's communications, sending a weekly email blast with links to videos you've created, just kind of providing multiple ways of communicating, because every product team is going to be different, right? Some are going to want just quick audio stuff on the side. Some are going to want to sit and read through a newsletter. Some are going to want to come and talk with you directly. So offering office hours for teams to come and talk. Also reaching out, seeing if you can join in on different product teams, crits, or, if they're doing a sprint planning, see if you can just join in and, not from we want to be the design system team watching what you're doing, but hey, we want to learn how you're utilizing the design system so we can continue to evolve this for your uses.
All right, we now have another question here, which is, after just updating or designing a design system, did you find any mistakes in that system or realize there are some scenarios you didn't consider during designing that people are already using? How do you handle that situation, or what do you do next? Do you let people use it until the next update? This is really like one of the things we were covering earlier, is communicating some of those changes that are there. But in addition to that, also having documented best practices for how to communicate back into the design system as well. And we covered that a lot in the actual documentation building block session that we did. I'd highly recommend kind of watching that one. We'll post that link a little bit later, and it'll also be in the deck that we publish later on. But that's really the best way to kind of manage these things, is have an avenue to talk back to the design system and contribute back to it. That way, when you actually have teams that are using these components in new and innovative ways, it'll allow you to really evaluate that and decide, do I want this in my design system? And if so, here's how I actually adapt it and pull it back in and make it an actual standard thing that all teams can use. Or is that really just a very specific use case for just that team that's using this? And if that's the case, it may be better suited in an actual team-specific library that they are using.
Awesome.
All right. Next question here is, will preferred values for instance swaps eventually work with hidden/unpublished components or child components prefixed with a dot or an underscore? Right now, this actually doesn't work for any sort of local unpublished components. It is a request that we have, and it is something that we're actually looking into. It does work with hidden components, though. So by all means, use those dots and those prefixes as long as they are actually published as well, which is a weird kind of like interim state that they're in. And this is a two-parter. Actually combine those two on purpose if you want to zoom out real quick, Chad.
Okay.
It's the same question. So this is the question of, are there plans to make it selective? What nested instance properties are bubbled up? And will exposing props for nested instances allow us to cherry pick which of those specific props are there? Yeah, look, one of the things we wanted to do with this actual exposed nested instance props is just to get it out as quickly as possible for the community so that you could start using it today. We're very aware of the demand to actually select the individual props that you are bubbling up. And it is something that we will look to address in the future. Right now, though, we're really focused on getting tokens out. So that's the one thing that we're really kind of going forward on at the moment. And then once that is done, then we'll relook at kind of exposing the individual specific props that are there. So yes, it's something we're aware of. It's something we definitely want to work on. But yeah, we got some other stuff that's coming through that we think you're going to love as well.
Awesome. So if the change is big, we usually duplicate the component and call it like checkbox 2.0. Yep. And let designers know to update. Is that the best practice for big changes? Yeah, Dominic, so we talked a little bit about this before, and right, if it is a big breaking change, it can totally make sense to make it a new component. If you're doing a full refactor, kind of two approaches to this, where one, you may just have that 2.0 component living right in the library file, and you're having folks switch over with an instance swap to that new component before eventually deprecating the old. If it's a big library update where you are refactoring a bunch of components, typically we'll see folks duplicate their library file and refactor all of the components, and then everyone can use swap library to that new components and new library later. There's some great things out there as far as when it comes to deprecating older components and migrating to new ones. One article that is still really relevant today, and I always recommend, was from Steve Dennis, great community member, put out an article a couple of years ago, and it's still really good on how to approach deprecating components. So that's an article I would definitely take a look at for best practices for deprecating components and migrating to new versions.
All right, this one. Any plans to add something like a visual litmus test as an option when reviewing modified components or component sets prior to publishing changes? This is a great question. It's definitely something that we are considering as well. Right now, we did actually very recently just actually push an update for when you're actually updating, you can review some of these things and really have at least some of the visual diff that's there on the update consumption side. But we haven't looked at anything for the publishing side yet. It is an area that we obviously want to make improvements on. It's just the list is long of things we want to get to. So apologies, Mike, we don't have that right now. You are going to have to rely on that actual like manual kind of litmus test.
All right, we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions here.
Let's see, is there any real good ones? We talked about tokens a little bit, litmus tests. There's this one here, Chad, which is there was mention of not recommending the usage of base components. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Yeah, I would love to talk through this. So one of the things we see with base components right now is there's a lot of nested instances with specific overrides on them. One of the interesting things that I didn't even realize before I joined Figma was that you can actually architect things with the base component architecture such that when you're swapping between states of it, there's actually no correct way to transfer the overrides between those two states. And that's something we only see with base component architectures. There's just a lot of issues that come up with it because of how these things actually work under the hood. So one of the things we really recommend against is in using those base component architectures so that you avoid those issues when updating those components and losing overrides, or when your designers are swapping between various components and also losing overrides there as well. In order to really make sure those overrides transfer correctly between items that you're swapping between, we recommend against those base component architectures and just keep things as flat as possible. And we found that with the introduction of component props, especially with some of the other features that we have with it, like kind of preferred values that are there, it's much easier to architect those fully kind of flat structures. The base component architectures were super valuable when we only had variants and you wanted to avoid that combinatoric explosion of variants that were there. Then it made total sense to use them. Now with component props where you can do things like Boolean props for visibility, we really don't have that explosion problem anymore of those variants. So we recommend avoiding it as much as possible. Chad, any other things that you would say there?
Yeah, I would say as someone who has built libraries, both using base components as well as then refactor them to not use base components, as well as just, talking with a lot of folks in the community and seeing their libraries and their transitions from base to non-base components. A lot of what's left in base components versus component properties, it's about one-click difference for maintainers of libraries. we didn't even cover today, like all of the pieces of it, but being able to multi-select within a component set to bulk edit things. That's one of the most common reasons that we would hear folks using base components. If I want to update the label on all of these variants, I have to go select everything, then do it. It's one click now, same as it was with using a base component. So, but just the cons outweigh the pros for the consumers of it. And one thing, I'm going to butcher your quote, Jacob, but I'm quoting you here. Nested instances, exposing nested instances, it will help make the consumption of base components a little less stressful, but it's still not an ideal solution to continue with base components. The performance, it's not quite there, and it's not as great of a consumption experience for teams.
Absolutely. And if you already have a system that has those base components, and this was in the comments as well, it's something you really want to test if you're trying to migrate away from it. There are going to be situations, especially when you're updating from a base component architecture to a non-base component architecture, where you are going to lose some of those overrides that are there. So be sure to test it before you do that. And if you are making that big update, consider doing it as a V2 of your actual component library, rather than as an actual update that's there. Just be careful, test, go forward and change all those things. And yeah, thanks for joining for the Q&A. Chad, what else do we got here?
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. We try to get to as many as we can, and definitely feel free to follow up with us. You can reach out on Twitter. We're always happy to chime in there as we have a chance. But Jacob talked about this a little bit earlier, and with our next building blocks, we're going to pause a little bit. Our next one probably won't be until late November, early December, because we have Schema coming up, our annual design system conference. I am stoked for this because this year we're hitting the road. So we're going to be hosting Schema in person in New York, in London, in Tokyo, as well as having a virtual event for everyone. And Jacob, you're doing something with Schema, aren't you?
I am indeed. I'll be on stage doing some keynote stuff, which will be very fun. Super excited to talk about not only the trends that we've seen in the last year, but also what I see the future of design systems being. But I believe that you are also involved here, Chad, and you're going to be a host as well.
Yes, I will be in New York for Schema New York. So for anyone who is coming out to that, excited to meet with folks and say hello. So lots of great talks are coming up. I won't spoil it for anyone, but it's going to be so exciting.
Oh man, there's some really good ones this year, and I'm really excited for it. But also, I'm excited that it's actually going to be an in-person event. We could actually see you face to face and interact with people, which is going to be so good. It's been so long since it's happened.
Yes,
I'm excited for that. And really, with you hosting, me on stage, it's basically just going to be another episode of Building Blocks. So it's totally okay that we paused it.
Building Blocks Live. There we go. But it's going to be great. Showcase some of the community. Absolutely excited for this. Also, I think we're going to pause a little bit as well before our next Building Blocks, because as we just experienced with the Q&A today, right? You have so many fantastic questions. And as a key piece I talked about with communication being key and office hours with your teams, we're actually going to plan for our next Building Blocks to be a full office hours AMA. So bring all of your design system questions, whether it's related to Figma features and Figma libraries, or you're curious about questions on building culture around design systems. You're talking, looking for advice on governance advice or for helping build contribution models. Feel free to bring any of those questions. We would love to have the conversation and address them. So with our perspectives. So in the meantime, definitely feel free to connect. If you have questions, you can always get help on help.figma.com. Continue to share your great product ideas and engage on forum.figma.com. And also our friends.figma.com, where you can learn about events all around the world, as well as check out our Friends of Figma Discord and connect with us there as well. And Jacob, would you like to close us out today?
More than happy to. So we had a few of these questions in the comments as well. The session is recorded. The recording will be available on youtube.com/Figma Design afterwards. Be sure to check out there for not only the recording of this, but also a link to the full playlist of all of the other ones that we've done as well. And as always, we will have future live streams as well. Please join us for those ones, figma.com/events to see any new ones that are coming up. And last but not least, if you have any suggestions and ideas, which are super valuable, especially to product managers like myself, seriously, we heavily read these on a very regular basis. So please send them over to community@figma.com. It's the #1 way that we really actually get this feedback from you at the community, and that's how we decide which features to prioritize. So thank you all for joining. Super happy to walk you through this. Go enjoy some props V2, and Chad, we'll see all of them at Schema, hopefully.
Hopefully, yes. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one.
Cheers, all.